Okay, once again, good afternoon. We are going to have our last topic before school reopens. Now, they have extended or they have rescheduled the reopening of school. And so we are going to have our last topic before you come to school. We are going to have a very important topic so far as business management is concerned. And even in life, you need it in life. And that is what we are going to have today. So you have to be very attentive. You have to try as much as possible to understand the things we are going to do, because they are very important for you in life. Now, if you, for example, today bought food and you ate the food and something happened to you, let's say there was food poisoning, what will you do? 2, you bought a book. Then you realize that about 10 pages, about 20 pages were missing. What will you do? If somebody bought something from you and the person did not pay, what will you do? Or what do you have to do? Do you go and fight with the person? What do you do? The person is not ready to pay. You want your money. What do you do? And that is what we'll be looking at from today. So today we are going to look at law of contract. That's what we'll be looking at, law of contract. And it's an aspect of commercial law. So we have commercial law. When you say commercial, then certainly it involves trade. So when you talk about commercial law, then you know what such laws will be dealing with. And one example of commercial law is law of contract. There are others. We'll be looking at law of agency. We'll be looking at sales of goods, and so on and so forth. All those things come together and they will talk about law or commercial law. So today, in law of contract, by the time we finish with today's lesson, these are the things you should be able to do. Number 1, you should be able to define contract. When you say contract, what is it? Number 2, you should be able to distinguish between social agreements and domestic agreements. When you say social agreement, what is it? When you say domestic agreement, what is it? Number 3, you should be able to explain why social agreements are not enforceable. And you learn about when you say that something is not enforceable. What does that mean? Then you should also be able to at least mention 5 types of contract and then be able to explain them. So that is what we'll be looking at for today. Then we'll continue the next time. So what is a contract? That's the first thing. Just as I told you, we enter into contracts either consciously or unconsciously. In other words, there are certain times you are entering into contract. You know that you are entering into contract. The two of you sit down and then you decide what somebody should do, what the other person also should do. And you know that if one person does not do what he or she is supposed to do, the action that can be taken against the person, you know it. Then there are certain times you enter into a contract, we don't even know you have entered into a contract. So that's what I meant by we consciously and unconsciously enter into contracts. You remember I said if you bought books and there some pages were conspicuously missing, if you bought food and there was food poisoning, you ate the food and you had problem as a result of the food, that particular food you ate, what will you do? That is where contract comes in. So what is a contract? When you say contract, what is it? Look at here. I said, the first thing I said here is that there's agreement. And that this agreement, is it enforceable? There's an agreement. Is the agreement enforceable? That's number one. Number two, is the agreement not enforceable? So you can have an agreement with somebody. Then the agreement, is it enforceable? In other words, if the person doesn't do what the person is supposed to do, can you take the person to court for the court to enforce that agreement? To enforce means for the court to compel the person to do what the person was supposed to have done. For example, you entered into an agreement with somebody and you were supposed to supply the person with some raw materials. And the person is supposed to pay 30,000 Ghana cedis. So the two of you have entered into agreement. You are to supply raw materials and the person is supposed to pay 30,000 Ghana. That is an agreement. But the question is, if the person doesn't do what he or she is supposed to do, can you go to court and ask the court to compel the person to do that? In other words, for the court to ask the person to pay the 30,000 Ghana cedis. If that is the case, then the first one, which is that the agreement has come, number one, and that if you can go to court for the court to compel the person to do it, then it means that that agreement can be enforced. That agreement can be enforced. The two of you entered into the agreement. One doesn't want to do what he or she is supposed to do. You cannot go and box the person. You cannot go and fight the person. So there is law. So you go to court. That's why we call it law enforcing agency. Law enforcing agencies. So we have law enforcing agencies there. If you are supposed to do something and you don't do, there is an agency that has been established. And that sees to it that it compels you to do what you are supposed to do. Are you supposed to pay tax? If you don't pay the tax, there is a law enforcing or enforcement agency there that will compel you to pay the tax. So there are law enforcement agencies there. So if you entered into an agreement with somebody and the person doesn't do what he or she is supposed to, and it can be enforced in court of law, then it means it is a contract. That means that agreement you entered into with the person, if it can be enforced in court, then we call it contract. But if the agreement is said that it cannot be enforced in court, that means when you go to court, the court will not, they will tell you that this one, we cannot go through the judicial process. That means the agreement is not enforceable. And if it's not enforceable, then it means it is not a contract. That means that for us to say there is a contract, there must be agreement. There can never be a contract without agreement. But the fact that there is agreement too does not mean there is a contract. That means some agreements are not contract. Some agreements, I repeat, that means some agreements are not contracts. So it is said that all contracts are agreements. But it is not it is not all agreements that are contract. It is not all agreements that are contract. But all contracts are agreements. That means there can never be a contract without agreement. So that is what you have to take note of. So that is why I said agreement. If it is enforceable, then it means it is a contract. Agreement, if it is not enforceable, that means it is not a contract. And I've also told you that all contracts are agreement, but it's not every agreement that is a contract. Now, generally, all commercial agreements are contracts. Generally, all commercial agreements are contracts. Now, when you say commercial, when you say it comes from the word, there's commerce inside. When you say commerce, it means it involves trade. So once the agreement is a commercial one, like you are buying something from somebody, you are supposed to pay money, the person is supposed to give you that thing, that is commercial. You know, some cars, we say this is a commercial car. It's not a private car, it's a commercial car. That means it is working for money. You bought it, you pay your fare. So it's commercial. It is commercial. So if there is an agreement and it's a commercial agreement, then in general, the general rule is that it is a contract. Except that the person do not want it to be a contract. Commercial agreements are contract. But if the two of us are entering into a commercial agreement, then we say that, okay, even though I want you to supply me with raw materials, and I will pay 30,000 Ghana cedis, please, if you supply and I don't pay, you cannot take me to court. I accept it. Okay, if I also pay and you don't supply, I will not take you to court. That means it is not enforceable in court. If that is the case, then even though it is a commercial agreement, it is not a contract. That's why we said in general, all commercial agreements are contract. But if the parties do not want it to be an agreement, then it will not be an agreement. That is number one. Number two, social and domestic agreements are not contract. So in general, social and domestic agreements are not contract. So the question you ask is, what is a social agreement? And what is a commercial agreement? Now when you say social, you see the word social, you understand what is meant by social. You are doing social studies. You know what society is. So when you say social, then it is related to relationship. And that relationship is among people. But in law, when you say social agreement, then or domestic agreement, the domestic agreement is any agreement between a husband and a wife, or parents and their children. That is domestic. When you say something is domestic, then it is related to home. So when you are doing international, you say home trade, international trade, domestic trade. So something that is domestic is related to home. So domestic agreement, that means if a husband and a wife enter into agreement, it will not be considered as contract. Now let me reiterate this. At your level, let's keep it like that. But when you move up to a higher level, you learn somewhere exceptions to this one. That there are certain times a husband and a wife will enter into agreement and it will be considered as contract. But at your level, SHS, let us drop it here. That domestic agreements are not contract. Let us drop it here. And we shall look at a certain case, Balfour versus Balfour, to confirm that domestic agreements are not contract. So that is domestic agreement, agreement between a husband and a wife, or agreement between spouse, and then an agreement between parents and then their children. So it's domestic agreement. So if a husband makes a promise to a wife that is going to fulfill an obligation, and the husband does not fulfill the obligation, what this rule is saying is that the wife cannot enforce that agreement in court, because it is called domestic agreement, and domestic agreements are not enforceable. Why? That is the question we have to ask ourselves. Why domestic agreements cannot be enforced in court? Number one, in law, intentions are very important. Your intentions are very important. So the law says that it is very difficult for anybody to assume that when at the time a husband was making promise to a wife, then the wife had the intention that if my husband fails or to fulfill the promise, then I will take legal action against him. It is said it will be very difficult for a wife to be thinking like that. That your husband has promised that every month he traveled and he said every month, I'll be sending this money to you, and your husband doesn't fulfill that agreement. Then they say, how possible that as at the time the husband was making the promise, the wife was thinking that if my husband fails to fulfill that promise, then I will take legal action against my husband. So in law, they say domestic agreements are not contract because the intention to create legal relation was absent. There was no intention to create legal relation. And that is what I've already explained to you. That the wife, there was no intention in respect of the wife that should the husband fail to fulfill that agreement, she would take legal action against the husband. So we say domestic agreements are not enforceable because the intention to create legal relation was absent, was not there. And the second even reason could also be that if the wife did not even provide any consideration, and we will learn about what consideration is very soon. So that is for that one. Now let me sum up what we have done so far. We have learned that when we say a contract, it's an agreement made between two or more parties. Made between two or more parties. Now, I hope you have captured it. Get closer to it. Get closer. Make two or more parties. Now, when you say parties, it's a term that we are going to use in law. You remember I said you entered into a contract with somebody. You are supposed to supply raw materials. The person is supposed to pay 30,000 Ghana cedis. You are one of the parties. You are a party to the contract. And the person too is a party. So when you say parties to a contract, the people who have entered into the contract are those we call parties to the contract. So let us note that one. So when you say a contract, it's an agreement made between two or more parties, which is enforceable by law. That aspect is very, very important, which is enforceable by law. So this is what makes it a contract. A mere agreement cannot be a contract. But if the agreement is enforceable by law, if one party fails to fulfill his or her obligation, another party can take legal action against him or her. The other party can go to court. Then it means it is enforceable by law. That means there is a contract. But if the agreement is said that you cannot take legal action against the person, that is not called contract. And I've given you examples that domestic agreements are not contract. Then we also made mention of social agreement. What are social agreements? They are those that are entered into by or among or between or among friends. So if a friend makes promise to you and the friend does not fulfill that promise, it is not a contract because it cannot be enforced. Your friend told you he or she was going to prepare jollof rice for you, and that because of that you didn't even go for lunch, thinking that when the friend is going to bring the rice, then the friend did not bring the rice. The question is, can you take legal action against the person? No, you cannot. It's a social agreement and it is not enforceable by law. The person had moral obligation to give the rice to you. Moral obligation, but not a legal obligation. And in law, we don't look at morality. It's about law. What does the law say? So law is not something, so the Bible says, that is not what law is about. Law is not about, as a human being, that is not what law is about. That is not what law is about. So once it is a social agreement, it is not enforceable. Once it is a domestic agreement, it is not enforceable. But remember, I have told you, as you learn to a higher level, you come to realize that at a certain point in time, domestic agreements can be enforced. But that is not for you now. So that is for that one. So that is it. Now, I've asked a question here. There are two questions here. Let's look at the question. The first question is, who creates contract? That's the first question. Then the second question, what role does the court play? Now, the contract, who creates it? Who makes it? And what is the role of the court? Number one, the contract is created or is made by the parties themselves. It's the parties that enter into contract. The court does not make contract for the parties. The parties themselves will make their own contract. And so what role does the court play? That is where enforcement will come in. The court exists. The courts exist to see to it that the agreements that the parties have entered into are enforced. In other words, the court is there so that if you have entered into a contract with somebody and you fail to do your part, the court will ask you, the court will compel you to do what you are supposed to do. Or if you are supposed to pay what you call damages to the person, you learn about that one, you pay that one. So the court exists to just enforce contract. The court does not make contract for anybody. So let us also note that one. So that is all that a contract is. Now we are going to move to our next subtopic, types of contract. Types of contract. We'll be looking at simple contract, specialty contract, and so on and so forth. So what are the types of contract we have? Number one, we have what you call simple contract. What is a simple contract? Now, a simple contract is Or, when it says simple contracts, we are looking at the contracts that we enter into in our daily lives, which are not supported by deed. They are not supported by deed. Simple contracts are those contracts that we make in our daily lives which are not supported by deed. And when you say deed, we shall learn about the second one, specialty contract, which are those we call contract by deed. But simple contracts are not supported by deed. They are not made by deed. What does that mean? What it means is that when you say a simple contract, they are those contracts that we enter into. It can be oral, it can be written, it can be implied. But there is no third party to sign. The deed is a document that is, once it's a document, it means it is written and it must be signed by a third party. Remember I said people who are into contract are the parties. Anybody who is not a party to the contract is called a third party. If you are not a party to a contract, you are called a third party. And simple contracts are those contracts that we enter into in our daily lives. And they are not made by deed. That's why we call them simple. They are not contracts as official, as formal as the other one we call specialty contracts. So there are no third parties to witness. And what supports a simple contract is what we call consideration. So all simple contracts must be supported by consideration. What is consideration? Let me make it simple here. We shall do that one as a topic. You know, when you buy a book from somebody, you pay money, is that not it? The money you pay in law is called consideration. The amount of money you pay is your consideration. The person gave you what? Book, of course, and the book is called consideration from the person. So you see, in law, you pay something and then you get something. And it's not only money, it can be any other thing. The person may ask you to do something for money or not to do something for money. So if the person asks you that you should not go to a certain place on a certain day and the person was going to give you 100 cedis, what is the consideration that you will provide? The consideration is not going to the place. So if you don't go to the place, you have provided consideration. The person will also provide consideration by giving you money. If somebody's item was missing, the person said, whoever finds it and returns it will be given 500 Ghana cedis. When you find it, that is your consideration. And the person 500 Ghana cedis is the person's consideration. So anytime there is simple contract, there must be consideration. Without it, a contract cannot be enforced. And now you understand what is meant by cannot be enforced. If you go to somebody and say, oh, leave this thing for me, you don't pay anything, you have not given any consideration, and the person sells it, can it be enforced? That is something I want you to think about. So that is for simple contract. A simple contract is any contract that we enter into which is not supported by deed, but it is supported by consideration.